February 3, 1945, about 1835, Manila, Philippines. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the rice paddies and the dusty roads leading south. For the men of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division, the first team, the last 66 hours had been a blur of gasoline fumes, rattling tracks, and sleepless momentum. They were the tip of the spear, a flying column ordered by General Douglas MacArthur to ignore their flanks, bypass enemy strongpoints, and drive hard for the capital. The objective was singular and desperate: get to Manila before the Japanese garrison could execute the thousands of civilian prisoners known to be rotting in the city's internment camps. As the lead elements of the 8th Cavalry Regiment rolled past the city limits, the skyline of Manila rose up to meet them, the pearl of the Orient. To the eyes of the young American troopers, it looked intact, a sprawling metropolis of colonial architecture, wide boulevards, and the promise of the end of the war. They did not yet know that they were entering a kill zone. They did not know that the city before them was about to become the site of the fiercest urban combat in the Pacific Theater, a graveyard for over 100,000 civilians, and a landscape of total devastation. At that moment, however, the mission was rescue. The column roared toward the University of Santo Tomas. For 3 years, this sprawling campus had served as a prison for roughly 4,000 Allied civilians, Americans, British, Australians, men, women, and children who had been trapped when the Philippines fell in 1942. Inside the gates, the internees were starving. They were living on less than 700 calories a day, skeletal figures waiting for a liberation they feared would never come, or worse, waiting for the execution orders that many believed were imminent. When the first American tank, a Sherman named Battalion Basic, crashed through the iron gates of the university, the reaction was not immediate cheer, but stunned silence followed by a tidal wave of hysteria. Gaunt men and women wept openly. Children who had forgotten the taste of milk touched the dusty fatigues of the cavalrymen as if they were seeing ghosts. The liberation of Santo Tomas was a moment of pure, unadulterated grace in a war defined by brutality. The 1st Cavalry had won their race. They had saved nearly 4,000 lives before the Japanese guards could carry out any final, spiteful orders. The euphoria continued into the next day, February 4. Elements of the 37th Infantry Division, the Buckeye Division from the Ohio National Guard, pushed into the city to liberate Bilibid Prison. This was a place of dark reputation, a stone fortress of misery. Inside, the soldiers found over 800 American prisoners of war and 500 civilians. These were the men who had been left behind. Many were survivors of the Bataan Death March, men who had endured the hell ships and the labor camps. They were found abandoned by their Japanese guards, emaciated and sick, but alive. For 48 hours, it seemed as if MacArthur's prophecy had been fulfilled without the bloodbath many had feared. On February 6, the general released a communiqué prematurely announcing that Manila had fallen, that the capital was liberated. It was a statement born of optimism and perhaps a desire to headline the news cycle, but on the ground, the reality was curdling into something far more sinister. Manila had not fallen. It had only just been breached. While General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the supreme commander of Japanese forces in the Philippines, had indeed ordered a withdrawal from the city to preserve his army for a mountain defense, the order was ignored by the man actually holding the capital. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commander of the Manila Naval Defense Force, had no intention of retreating. Whether driven by a samurai's code of honor, a desire to redeem himself for past failures at sea, or simply a fanatical adherence to holding naval facilities, Iwabuchi chose to turn Manila into a fortress. He had approximately 17,000 troops under his command. The majority, about 12,500, were naval personnel, Marines, construction battalions, and grounded air crews, bolstered by 4,500 Imperial Army soldiers who had not withdrawn with Yamashita. They were not the jungle fighters the Americans had spent 3 years learning to kill. These were men with their backs to the sea, entrenched in a city built of stone and reinforced concrete. Manila was unique in the Pacific. It was not a collection of bamboo huts or temporary bunkers. It was a modern Western city designed to withstand earthquakes. The government buildings were neoclassical giants with thick walls. The old Spanish fortress of Intramuros was a medieval citadel with moats and 40-foot thick walls. The residential districts were grids of concrete homes. Iwabuchi's engineers had spent weeks fortifying these structures. They barricaded intersections with trolley cars and steel beams. They turned second-story windows into machine gun nests. They mined the streets and rigged the bridges for demolition. They possessed over 350 anti-aircraft and dual-purpose guns, weapons designed to shoot down planes that were now leveled horizontally, aimed down the long avenues at approaching American infantry. As the 37th Infantry Division and the 1st Cavalry Division tried to push south of the Pasig River, the celebration ended abruptly. The Pasig, a wide, muddy artery bisecting the city, became the dividing line between salvation and hell. The bridges were blown, their spans collapsing into the water, forcing the Americans to conduct amphibious crossings under fire. The fighting that erupted on February 7 and intensified over the following week was unlike anything the U.S. Army had experienced in the Pacific. In the jungles of Guadalcanal or the beaches of Leyte, cover was vegetation and concealment. In Manila, cover was concrete, but the enemy was everywhere. A single sniper in a church steeple could pin down a company. A hidden 20 cannon in a basement could shred a platoon. The Americans had to learn urban warfare on the fly. They learned that a tank on a city street is a blind giant, vulnerable to Molotov cocktails and magnetic mines dropped from upper stories. They learned that capturing a building didn't mean walking through the front door. It meant blasting a hole in the wall with a 75 gun, throwing in grenades, and clearing it room by bloody room. By February 9, the 37th Infantry Division was grinding into the district of Paco. The resistance was fanatical. The Paco Railroad Station, a concrete structure converted into a defensive strongpoint, became a scene of extraordinary violence. It was here that the individual heroism of the American soldier began to tip the scales against the entrenched Japanese defense. Private Cleto L. Rodriguez and Private John N. Reese, Jr., of the 148th Infantry Regiment, found their platoon pinned down by intense fire from the station and nearby pillboxes. Realizing the advance had stalled, the two men made a decision that defied tactical logic but defined the spirit of the assault. Acting on their own initiative, they moved forward under a hail of bullets. They didn't crawl, they maneuvered, firing their rifles and throwing grenades with terrifying precision. Rodriguez and Reese moved to a house 60 yards from the objective and engaged the enemy for over 2 hours. They killed 35 Japanese defenders and effectively neutralized the heavy machine gun positions that had paralyzed the American advance. By the time their ammunition was spent and the smoke cleared, the two privates had killed 35 Japanese defenders and wounded dozens more, breaking the back of the resistance at the station. Their actions, for which they would receive the Medal of Honor, allowed the 148th to surge forward, but the victory at Paco was a grim indicator of what lay ahead. Every block, every rail yard, every concrete administrative building was a fortress that had to be reduced by men willing to walk into the fire. As the American perimeter tightened, the Japanese defense devolved into something far darker than a military stand. By February 10, with the 37th Infantry Division pressing from the north and the 1st Cavalry Division flanking from the east, the trapped garrison under Rear Admiral Iwabuchi turned its frustration and fanaticism against the people of Manila. The Pearl of the Orient became a slaughterhouse. This phase of the battle, now known as the Manila Massacre, remains one of the most harrowing chapters of the Pacific War. Japanese Marines and soldiers, realizing escape was impossible and victory unattainable, began a systematic campaign of atrocities. They moved through the districts of Ermita and Malate, rounding up civilians, men, women, and children, herding them into homes and public buildings, and setting the structures ablaze. Those who tried to flee the flames were bayoneted or machine-gunned in the streets. The American GIs, many of whom had seen the worst of the jungle war in New Guinea and the Solomons, were unprepared for the scale of the carnage they uncovered as they advanced. They found chapels filled with bodies, schools turned into execution sites, and residential blocks where the stench of death hung heavy in the humid air. The psychological impact on the liberating forces was profound. The desire to save the city was rapidly replaced by a cold, hard resolve to exterminate the enemy force that was butchering the population. The rules of engagement changed. General MacArthur had initially placed strict restrictions on the use of heavy artillery and air support to preserve the historic architecture and protect the civilians. But the Japanese were using those very buildings, the sturdy, earthquake-proof colonial structures, as bunkers to slaughter the advancing infantry. Faced with mounting American casualties and the ongoing massacre of Filipino civilians, the commanders on the ground, Major General Baitler of the 37th and Major General Mudge of the 1st Cavalry, had no choice but to bring the full weight of their firepower to bear. The restrictions were lifted. The battle for Manila transformed into a war of heavy ordnance. 155 long tom cannons and 105 howitzers were brought up to fire over open sites, blasting point-blank into the facades of government buildings. Tanks rolled down the avenues, blowing apart the second stories of department stores where snipers lay in wait. The destruction was absolute. The business district, once the hub of commerce in Southeast Asia, was pulverized. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, not by the erratic destruction of a brawl, but by the methodical application of high-explosive shells required to dig out a dug-in enemy. By mid-February, the city was a smoking ruin, but the heart of the Japanese defense still beat within the ancient walls of Intramuros. This was the walled city, the original Spanish colonial capital, a fortress within a city. Its stone walls were 40 feet thick in places, surrounded by moats and barricades. Inside this citadel, thousands of Japanese defenders had retreated, taking with them thousands of Filipino refugees as hostages. It was a tactical nightmare, a medieval fortress defended by modern automatic weapons, populated by innocent civilians, and besieged by an army that had run out of patience. The Americans paused to prepare the final blow. For days, the artillery hammered the perimeter of the walled city. The 37th Infantry Division, exhausted but relentless, moved into position for the assault. The plan was not to scale the walls, but to breach them. On February 17, the bombardment began in earnest, chipping away at the centuries-old stone. The noise was deafening, a continuous rolling thunder that shook the ground for miles. The dust from the pulverized masonry coated the sweating soldiers, turning them into gray statues as they waited in the rubble of the surrounding districts. On the morning of February 23, 1945, the finale began. At 7:30 hours, a massive artillery barrage opened up. 140 guns, howitzers, mortars, and tank destroyers unleashed a torrent of steel against the north and east walls of Intramuros. The objective was to create a breach wide enough for infantry and armor to pour through. For 60 minutes, the sky rained high explosives. The sound was so intense that men shouting into each other's ears could not be heard. Then, at 8:30, the guns shifted their fire deeper into the city, and the infantry stepped off. Troops from the 148th and 129th Infantry Regiments charged across the open ground and through the smoking breaches in the walls. They entered a landscape that defied description. Intramuros, once a place of cathedrals, convents, and old Spanish mansions, was a churned wasteland of broken stone and burning timber. The fighting inside was savage and confused. Japanese defenders fought from the ruins of the Manila Cathedral and the dungeons of Fort Santiago. They utilized a network of tunnels and basements, popping up behind American lines to launch suicide attacks. The GIs fought with flamethrowers and satchel charges, clearing the walled city yard by yard. Amidst the combat, the tragedy of the civilian hostages played out in horrific detail. Thousands of women and children poured out of the ruins, waving white rags, running through the crossfire to reach the American lines. Many were cut down by Japanese fire as they fled. Others were found dead in the cellars where they had been held. The liberation of Intramuros was less a rescue and more an excavation of the dead. The 37th Infantry Division, guided by Filipino guerrillas who knew the labyrinthine streets of the old city, methodically isolated the remaining pockets of resistance. As the Americans closed the trap, the fighting within the walled city devolved into a hunt through a subterranean labyrinth. The Japanese defenders, realizing the surface was lost, retreated into the bowels of the ancient capital, into the dungeons of Fort Santiago, the crypts of the San Agustin Church, and the storm drains that honeycomb the earth beneath the cobblestones. The 129th and 148th Infantry Regiments, men from the Ohio National Guard who had grown up in farm towns and industrial cities, found themselves waging a medieval siege with modern flamethrowers and satchel charges. They cleared the damp stone corridors of the Spanish citadel yard by yard, often fighting in near-total darkness, the air thick with the acrid smoke of burning flesh and the dust of pulverized masonry. By the time the sun set on February 24, the resistance in Intramuros was broken, reduced to isolated pockets of suicidal holdouts. But the liberation of the walled city revealed a horror that silenced even the most hardened veterans. In the dungeons of Fort Santiago, the Americans found the bodies of hundreds of Filipino civilians and POWs, executed by the Japanese in the final hours before the assault. They lay in heaps, starved and mutilated, a final testament to the brutality of the occupation. The historic heart of Manila, the seat of Spanish colonial power for centuries, was no more. It was a jagged landscape of broken stone, where the only standing structures were the hollowed-out shells of churches and the scarred ramparts of the walls themselves. Yet the battle for Manila was not over. While Intramuros smoked, the final and most formidable phase of the operation was unfolding just to the south, in the government center. Here, the Japanese had turned the massive, neoclassical administrative buildings of the Philippine Commonwealth into interconnected fortresses. The Legislative Building, the Finance Building, and the Agriculture Building were not merely offices. They were earthquake-proof monoliths of reinforced concrete, designed to withstand nature's fury, and now, they were withstanding the fury of the U.S. XIV Corps. Inside the Agriculture Building, the architect of this urban hell, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, watched his perimeter collapse. His Manila Naval Defense Force had been whittled down from a formidable garrison of 17,000 to a few thousand desperate survivors. He had defied General Yamashita's orders to withdraw, choosing instead to drag the city into the grave with him. Now, trapped in the wreckage of the government center, his options had narrowed to zero. On February 26, as American tanks blasted the lower floors of his command post and infantry closed in on the stairwells, Iwabuchi prepared for the end. In a ritual that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic slaughter outside, the admiral gathered his remaining staff officers. There was no escape, and surrender was culturally impossible. According to later accounts, Iwabuchi committed ritual suicide, likely by seppuku or a pistol shot to the head, choosing death over capture. His subordinates followed suit or charged out into the American machine guns in final, futile banzai attacks. The death of the commander, however, did not signal a ceasefire. The remaining Japanese troops, leaderless and cut off, fought on with a nihilistic frenzy that defied all military logic. The focus of the battle shifted to the Finance Building, the last major stronghold. This structure became the anvil upon which the 37th Infantry Division hammered the final remnants of the Japanese force. The fighting here was perhaps the most intense of the entire Pacific War. The building was a concrete blockhouse, its windows bricked up to leave only firing slits, its entrances booby-trapped, its hallways barricaded with sandbags and furniture. General Baitler, unwilling to sacrifice more of his men in suicidal room-clearing operations against an enemy that refused to surrender, ordered the heavy artillery to be brought up to point-blank range. It was a tactic born of necessity and exhaustion. 155 howitzers and 105 guns were wheeled into the streets, their barrels leveled horizontally at the finance building less than 200 yards away. The gun crews worked in a rhythmic trance, loading and firing, loading and firing. The concussion of the blasts shattered windows blocks away. High-explosive shells slammed into the concrete facade of the finance building, punching jagged holes through walls that were feet thick. The structure was systematically disassembled, floor by floor. Inside, the concussive force of the shells turned the air into a weapon, liquidating organs and shattering bones even without shrapnel. Yet, incredibly, whenever the shelling lifted and the American infantry tried to advance, they were met with withering machine gun fire from the rubble. The Japanese defenders were burrowing into the debris, fighting from behind the very mounds of concrete created by the American guns. This grind continued into early March. It was a war of attrition measured in inches. On March 3, 1945, the guns finally fell silent. The last resistance in the finance building was extinguished, not by surrender but by annihilation. The silence that descended on the city was heavy and unnatural. Manila was officially liberated. The 29-day battle was over. But as the dust settled, the magnitude of the Pyrrhic victory became visible. The Pearl of the Orient was gone. In its place stood a ruin comparable only to Warsaw or Stalingrad. The business district was 100% destroyed. The southern residential districts were 80% leveled. The utilities, power, water, sewage, were 70% non-functional. The stench of death was so overpowering that pilots flying reconnaissance missions over the city reported smelling it at 2,000 feet. The human cost was staggering. The U.S. forces had suffered over 1,000 killed in action and more than 5,500 wounded, a heavy toll, but one that paled in comparison to the devastation inflicted on the Japanese and the Filipinos. The Japanese garrison had been wiped out. Over 16,000 defenders lay dead in the ruins. But the true tragedy lay in the civilian count. Estimates placed the number of Filipino civilians killed during the month-long battle at over 100,000. They had died in the crossfire, crushed under collapsing buildings, and incinerated by artillery. But tens of thousands more fell victim to the bayonet and the flame, executed in a spree of violence that defied comprehension. These were not collateral damages of war. They were the targets of a defeated garrison lashing out in its death throes. The liberation of Manila, therefore, was a paradox of the highest order, a humanitarian mission that necessitated the leveling of the very city it sought to save. When the smoke finally cleared in early March, the scale of the devastation revealed itself to be absolute. Manila, once the Pearl of the Orient, a city of Spanish colonial charm and American neoclassical ambition, had been reduced to a skeleton of concrete and rebar. It stood alongside Warsaw as one of the most devastated Allied capitals of the entire Second World War. The statistics of the destruction were clinical, but the reality was visceral. In the business district, the destruction was total. 100% of the structures were gone or gutted. In the southern residential districts, where the middle class had once lived in nipa huts and hardwood homes, 80% of the area was scorched earth. The city's infrastructure, the veins and arteries of modern life, had been severed. 70% of the utilities, water, power, sewage, were non-functional. For the GIs of the 37th Infantry and the 1st Cavalry, the victory was hollowed out by the sensory overload of the aftermath. The smell of the city was perhaps the most enduring memory for those who survived. It was a cloying, sweet-rot stench of thousands of unburied bodies decomposing in the tropical heat, mixed with the acrid bite of cordite and wet ash. It was so overpowering that pilots flying reconnaissance missions in Piper Cubs reported smelling the death of Manila at an altitude of 2,000 feet. On the ground, the soldiers walked through a landscape that looked less like a city and more like the surface of a dead planet. The sturdy, earthquake-resistant buildings that Admiral Iwabuchi had turned into fortresses were now jagged tombstones. The legislative building, once a symbol of the Philippines' march toward independence, hung in shreds. Its reinforced concrete pillars snapped like dry twigs by the point-blank fury of 155 howitzers. Yet, amidst this landscape of ruin, the role of the Filipino people, specifically the guerrilla fighters, cannot be overstated. While the heavy armor and artillery of the XIV Corps provided the sledgehammer to break the Japanese defenses, it was the Filipino guerrillas who provided the scalpel. Throughout the month-long ordeal, these irregular fighters, often armed with captured Japanese Arasakas or pre-war American Enfields, served as the eyes and ears of the liberating force. They knew the labyrinthine streets of the older districts where maps failed. They knew which basements connected to the sewers and which walls concealed machine gun nests. In the final days of the assault on the government center, it was often a Filipino runner who would brave the sniper-infested streets to deliver crucial intelligence to a forward command post of the 37th Division. They fought alongside the Americans with a ferocity born of 3 years of brutal occupation. For them, this was not just a strategic objective. It was their home, their families, and their future being pulverized. The partnership between the American GIs and the Filipino guerrillas was forged in the rubble, a testament to a shared sacrifice that General MacArthur had promised to honor. MacArthur himself, the architect of the return, faced a grim reality. He had famously vowed, "I shall return," a promise that had sustained the Filipino resistance since his evacuation in 1942. He had prematurely announced the fall of Manila on February 6, driven perhaps by optimism or the need for a headline victory. But the grinding reality of urban combat had delayed the true end of the battle until March 3. When he finally toured the city, the devastation reportedly left him shaken. The capture of Manila was strategically vital. It was the key to the campaign to liberate the entirety of the Philippines and provided the deep-water port necessary to stage the eventual invasion of Japan. But the cost of that key was a city of ghosts. The battle also marked a significant tactical anomaly in the Pacific theater. For 3 years, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps had fought a war of jungles, coral atolls, and beachheads. They had learned to root out Japanese defenders from palm log bunkers and limestone caves. Manila was different. It was the first and only major urban combat experienced by U.S. forces in the Pacific. The lessons learned here were written in blood, and would have been the blueprint for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, had the war continued. The Americans learned that a tank in a narrow street is a trap without infantry support. They learned that a building is not cleared until every room, closet, and crawl space is checked. And they learned that in a city fight, artillery is a blunt instrument that kills the enemy but destroys the prize. The intensity of the combat is reflected in the citations for valor. The Luzon campaign saw the awarding of 22 medals of honor, with a significant number earned in the streets of Manila. Men like Private Rodriguez and Private Reese at the Paco Railroad Station, or the soldiers who threw themselves on grenades in the courtyards of Intramuros, displayed a level of heroism that spoke to the desperate nature of the fighting. The Japanese defenders, numbering around 17,000 at the start, 500 naval troops and 4,500 army personnel, had been almost entirely wiped out. Over 16,000 of them died in the ruins, adhering to a code that preferred death to the shame of surrender. But their annihilation required the U.S. forces to expend a staggering amount of ordnance and suffer over 6,500 casualties of their own, including 1,010 killed in action. The final act of the battle, the silencing of the guns at the Finance Building on March 3, brought a sudden, ringing quiet to the capital. The 1st Cavalry Division, which had raced down the central plains of Luzon with such speed and elan to liberate the internees at Santo Tomas, now stood guard over a wasteland. The 37th Infantry Division, the Buckeyes who had marched 150 miles from the Lingayen Gulf and battered their way through the hardest defenses, were exhausted men, their uniforms stained with the gray dust of pulverized concrete. They had done the impossible. They had retaken a fortified city from a fanatical enemy. But as they looked out over the Pasig River, choked with debris and bodies, the victory felt heavy. The liberation of Manila effectively broke the back of the Japanese resistance on Luzon, though fighting would continue in the mountains against General Yamashita's Shimbu group for months. The capital, however, was the center of gravity. Its fall signaled the end of the Japanese Empire's dominance in the Philippines. The stars and stripes flew again over the islands, just as MacArthur had promised. On February 27, just days before the final guns fell silent at the Finance Building, General MacArthur presided over a ceremony at the Malacanang Palace, one of the few government structures to survive relatively intact. In a voice trembling with emotion, he declared the restoration of the Commonwealth government, handing the reins of civil power back to President Sergio Osmeña. "My country has kept the faith," he told the assembly. But the context of that faith was visible through the shattered windows of the Capitol. The American flag that rose over the city did not wave above a celebration, but a requiem. Though the Pearl of the Orient had been reduced to a skeleton of steel and ash, bearing witness to the catastrophic price of freedom. While the chains of occupation were finally broken, the city and its people would carry the deep, jagged scars of their deliverance for generations to come. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.